Would you agree that there are times when you shouldn't tell a story? I know. That may sound weird coming from me, since most of what I talk about in this podcast is how and why you should tell stories and how to make them come alive with story theater and all that. But there are times and situations where telling a story is not appropriate. It doesn't fit. Or where you can tell a story, but the story you want to tell is the wrong story. And I'm speaking from experience, painful and embarrassing experience, as well as my experience from coaching hundreds of people on their stories. In other words, if the story doesn't fit, you must omit. Just omit that story from your speech. Remove it from your speech or presentation. Omit it. So in this podcast episode, I want to talk about the pitfalls and potholes you can fall into when it's not appropriate to tell a story. Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life 20-minute podcast. I'm your keynote and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you some simple and practical storytelling hacks and techniques, tips and tricks from my 25-year keynote and storytelling experiences, lessons learned from teaching storytelling to small groups of leaders and sales teams, to main stage keynotes in hotel ballrooms and huge convention centers in front of thousands of people. My main goal is to give you the tools you need to choose, craft, and deliver your stories in a way that makes them stick. Stories that sell you and your product or service. Now, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, please click on the follow or subscribe button. Okay, are you ready? Let's get started. Here's a painful example of this lesson that I learned the hard way. I remember a speech that I gave a long time ago at a fancy 5-star hotel in Newport Beach, California, to a room full of executives. Now, this was way back when I was doing my Positive Power of Change keynote, before story theater. And I was used to doing keynotes on a stage, a raised platform in a hotel ballroom in front of hundreds or thousands of people. And all of a sudden, here I was in a small boardroom with about 10 people, and I was totally unprepared for the situation. I didn't know how to adapt or change my keynote, so I just did the same thing that I do in a ballroom, and it was not good. No way, it was not good. I had no room to move like I usually did. And to be honest, as a speaker, I was always pretty big, lots of movement and gestures and volume and comedy and drama. So I'm standing there with people sitting in chairs 2 or 3 feet from me, doing this main stage presentation and telling my streaking story and everything. And oh man, it was bad. It just didn't fit the situation or the room. I blew it. I absolutely blew it. And looking back, I should have omitted my streaking story. It was the wrong story for the occasion. And I learned my lesson, that different stories work in different situations. If the story doesn't fit, you must omit. So you've got to be strategic. Think about the room, the audience, the situation, and consider whether or not you should tell a story at all, or if the story you're thinking about telling is a good fit. Now, I also want to talk about stories that are incredibly powerful. Emotional stories about a trauma or a severe test, very personal stories, what I call crucible stories, but that you're too close to emotionally. And I ran into this lots of times when working with my coaching clients. They'd come to me with a story that they felt they needed to tell. In some cases, they actually felt an obligation to share their story because they knew others would benefit from it. Cancer stories and abuse stories and near-death experiences. But the problem was, when they'd start telling the story, when we started working on it, they had to stop midway because the emotions swelled up in them and they started crying and sometimes shaking. And at that point, I had to stop them and talk to them about emotional distance. So what's emotional distance? Emotional distance means that you can tell an emotional story, that you can harness the emotional power of the story without the emotion overpowering you. In other words, if you get upset every time you tell the story, so upset that you break down or cry uncontrollably, that means the trauma is still too close, that you don't have the emotional distance from it to tell the story in service of your audience rather than as therapy for yourself. Before you can tell a crucible story, a really powerful emotional story, you need to heal first. And healing takes time. And that amount of time is different for everyone. In some cases, not all, but in some cases, I've had to tell someone not to tell their story yet. And I want you to hear that, yet. So here's the deal. If you want to tell a story, but you're still angry when you tell it, omit it. If you're still wounded and it hurts to tell your story, omit it. If you want to tell your cancer story or abuse story, that's fine. That's fine. There's value to that. But it has to be told in a way that makes a point that serves your audience. Maybe someday you'll be able to tell that story with grace and craft and power. But until you have emotional distance, omit it. Tell another story. Another story that you may need to omit in certain situations is the one that you and your audiences have fallen in love with, that has worked in most situations, but doesn't belong in every speech or every situation. Now, I've told you in the past about my streaking story and how it put me on the map and got me booked hundreds of times. I mean, I made a lot of money with it. People requested it, but I got so dependent on it that it became a crutch. I started inserting it into every speech, every time. And one day when I was speaking to a room full of professional speakers, people that wanted to become professional speakers, I realized I was telling my streaking story to show off, to show how amazing and funny I was at telling stories, when what I really needed to do was to replace it with a story that served my audience, that taught them a lesson that they needed to learn about speaking. And over time, I stopped telling that story completely, not because it wasn't a good story. It was an amazing story, but because it didn't always fit. It had run its course. So I replaced it with new stories, with stories that fit the audience and the situation. Because if the story doesn't fit, you must omit. If you get a story like that, a story that everyone loves hearing, but it doesn't always fit the situation, all right, say it with me. If the story doesn't fit, you must omit. Another example of when a story doesn't fit, you must omit, is when the story is about someone you have unresolved issues with. You have valuable lessons to share from your relationship with them, but you feel conflicted talking about them because you'd be denigrate them in some way that may harm them or shame them. Now, I had this problem early on when I wanted to tell stories about my dad, Jerry Stevenson. My dad was an amazing man. He was the most important and significant role model in my life in both positive and negative ways. He was a leader, a community organizer, a speaker, and a really good father in many ways. He was my Boy Scout troop leader and encouraged me to follow his lead and give speeches. And when I was 13, I mean, this was so amazing. When I was 13, he arranged for me to give a 5-minute speech in front of a business meeting, in front of 150 community leaders. It was my first speech. And do you think that made a difference in my life? He was always providing opportunities for me like that. But he was also a Jekyll and Hyde type person. A big, joyous personality in public. Everybody loved him, but a moody and bitter tyrant at times. This was back in the 1950s and 60s, and he came from that old school mentality where the man of the house is the boss. And as time went on, his demons from his childhood got the better of him, and he became angry and withdrawn. And so I had this love-hate relationship with him. So you can see how I had some real conflicting emotions about telling stories about him, because I wanted to talk about how amazing he was as a leader and a speaker and a role model. But at one point I realized I can't tell any stories about my dad until he's passed. So I held back from telling any stories about him, positive or negative, until he had died. And I felt that I was no longer in danger of tarnishing him. And that's why I feel free to talk about him now with you, to make this point about when not to tell a story. So if you have a story about someone that you still have unresolved issues with, you may want to omit that story. Now, here's another situation where you may want to omit a story when the story is just too long. I mean, it's a 10-minute story, and you really need a 3-minute story. And I do not, please hear this, I do not suggest you try and shrink a 10-minute story into a 3-minute story on the spot. It won't work. It will not work. Some stories are 10-minute stories, and they deserve to be 10-minute stories. And this is where you need to go into your story journal and find another story, a shorter story to develop. Now, if you don't have a story journal or a story database, you might want to start one. I have a Word document on my computer where I stick random story ideas and story titles. And I do the same thing for this podcast. I come up with all these different ideas for podcasts. That's where the title for this podcast came from. I was getting ready to be a guest on another podcast, and I was sitting at my desk jotting down ideas and phrases, things I wanted to make sure to talk about in the podcast. Phrases like, pay attention to your patterns. And in the process of brainstorming ideas, out popped the phrase, if the story doesn't fit, you must omit. Oh my gosh, the minute it popped out, I went, ooh, that's good. And bingo, I had an idea for a podcast episode, and here we are. So I want you to figure out a way to start a story journal or database where you capture story ideas, titles, phrases, points you want to make. So when the story you're planning to tell is too long or it's not a good fit, you can find something else to develop and replace it with. So before you step to the front of the room to tell your stories, ask yourself, does this story fit this occasion, this situation, this audience? Is it the right fit that makes the point I want to make that serves this audience? And if the story doesn't fit, you must omit. Just delete it and replace it. And if you're not sure, if you don't trust yourself to know if your story is the right fit, take advantage of my offer of a free 20-minute coaching call, and we'll figure it out together. Okay, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, something that you can use that will make your stories stick, stories that make you and your business marketable, memorable, and monetizable, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow and subscribe button. Second, share this podcast with 3 people or 10 people. And third, leave a review wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning and applying what you're learning. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. And if you want help with your stories, keynotes, or TED Talks, or if you want to schedule your free 20-minute coaching session, let's talk. Let's get in touch. Let's talk about it. You can email deborah@dougstevenson.com, and that's how we'll get going. deborah@dougstevenson.com. All right, well, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.